to destroy a lot of the houses in Heidelberg. After a couple of weeks, the city is conquered. Of course, a lot of the valuables are taken away. Again, the civil population has to suffer tremendously. And in the case of Heidelberg, it's very interesting that one of the most famous European libraries at the time, the Bibliotheca Palatina, which has more than 8,000 books, a very impressive number for this period, is taken by the Bavarians and sent to the Pope in Rome as a gift. And the important thing is that this library is still in the Vatican up until today. So that shows you even 400 years later, you can see some of the impact of the developments of the 30 Years' War. Yeah, if you look at Würzburg, where we are right now, we cannot really see the castle on the hill at the moment, but it would be very close just behind the ship that is next to us. In the case of Würzburg, it's very interesting that the city is not really affected by the war at all for the first 12 or 13 years. It's only in October 1631, when the Swedish army is conquering large parts of Central Europe, that Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedish king, is approaching with a large military. The Catholic Prince Bishop of Würzburg knows that, so he flees in time. The city is conquered by the Swedish army. About 700 soldiers of the imperial troops are retreating to the castle on the hill, which was not exactly that strongly fortified at that time. And this is why this castle is taken rather fast, and all the 700 imperial soldiers are killed by the Swedish troops, who claim that they would take revenge for Magdeburg. So that shows that the different locations of the war are very strongly connected. And also in the case of Würzburg, a library is stolen and is transported to Sweden in this case, where also the books are still up until today. In the case of Rothenburg, that some of you will visit tomorrow, that is a so-called imperial city, which is has to stay loyal to the Catholic emperor on the one side, but usually the nobility of these imperial cities is leaning far to the Protestant side. So they're a little bit in between, and they do sympathize a lot with the Swedish troops when they are also coming in October 1631. So they open the gates for the Swedish troops. However, very soon a Catholic army is coming again, putting Rothenburg under siege as well. The defenders do a very good job, but then the artillery hits one of the powder towers in the city wall, which explodes, and then the Swedish soldiers stop to fight. They get permission to leave the city, but of course the imperial troops want to take revenge, and this is where this legend comes into place that you will be told in Rothenburg tomorrow about the fact that the mayor manages to drink a huge vessel of wine, which the commander of the imperial troops demands if he wants to save the city. So about a gallon, that's what the legend says, he has to drink down without stopping in between. He manages to do that, and he saves the city by that, the so-called master's drink. And this is what, for example, this picture here is referring to. However, it is not really based in reality as far as we know. It is a legend, but the people of Rothenburg still like this story very much. For example, they play in historic costumes this story once every year, so that is part of the tradition of the city meanwhile. Yeah, another place I want to look at briefly is Bamberg. I think that is also part of your itinerary on this journey. And Bamberg is one of the examples for another very negative development during the time of the 30 Years' War, and that is the witch hunts that you find in many places, not only in the Holy Roman Empire, also in other parts of Europe, due to the very difficult situation of the war, but also all these bad harvests that I mentioned, for example, other things that people cannot really explain to themselves. They are looking for scapegoats in many cases, and of course hunting so-called witches is one of the strategies that people use. And that means innocent people are usually arrested in such a case, tortured and killed in the end, often on behalf of church officials. And Bamberg is one of the bishoprics where this happens in a very large number. More than 1,000 people are killed as so-called witches within 20 years. That is really a very high number there. And also Würzburg has a similar number of witch hunts. They do happen in entire Europe. They happen in Protestant and in Catholic places, but the numbers are higher in bishoprics like Würzburg and Bamberg, especially during the time of the 30 Years' War. Yeah, the last place I want to look at is Nuremberg, which was one of the most powerful imperial cities in those days. About 50,000 inhabitants in within the old city walls that you can see there. Nuremberg is also a free imperial city which has turned Protestant very early, only 8 years after the Reformation in 1525. So when the Swedish troops are coming, in 1632, once again, the gates are open for them. Gustavus Adolphus resides in the center of the city, but then the powerful warlord Wallenstein is coming with the Catholic troops. No less than 80,000 people are building a huge camp outside of Nuremberg and put Nuremberg under siege. And we have about 18,000 Swedish soldiers within the city walls. They do not really receive a lot of supplies anymore, of course. And for this reason, we have a lot of starvation in the 70 days that the siege lasts. In the end, it comes to a battle between the Swedish and the imperial troops, which doesn't really have a victor. In the end, both armies are moving away. But Nuremberg is an example for a place that suffers a lot from the consequences because the plague breaks out very soon afterwards. Most of the crops are destroyed, and Nuremberg has basically only 50% of the population left after the end of the 30 Years' War. Well, the last chapter of the 30 Years' War is written in a place that you didn't really see on your journey, but which is rather close to the Rhine River, so where you came from the north. We have about 60 miles away from the river Münster and Osnabrück, the two towns where the negotiations were made to end the 30 Years' War finally. That takes 8 years in total, a time in which the battles are still continuing. And then finally in October 1648, the different participants of the war are putting their signature under the peace treaty, which states, for example, that there should be religious tolerance for the future, this time including the Calvinists as well. It also gives a guarantee for the imperial states in the Holy Roman Empire that their rights will be observed against the emperor. We have additional territory as part of the peace treaty for places like Bavaria, France, and Sweden, for example. And the number of of prince electors in the system is increased from 7 to 8. Which means you have now Bohemia back, and also the Duke of Bavaria become a prince elector. Switzerland and the Netherlands are getting independence through this document. So it is actually a very well-balanced, reasonable peace. But if you look at all the compromises that are found, you wonder why it was necessary to fight for 30 years to achieve that in the first place. Of course, it might have been much easier if you think about that. The system that is established at this point is called by political scientists Westphalian sovereignty. That means for the first time in history in Europe it is stated that even small territories should be protected. No other power has the right to interfere. The idea, of course, of the Westphalian Treaty was not really to end war. It was rather to provide guidelines that make it more controlled and more reasonable than it had been in the 30 Years' War. And political scientists say that basically many of the principles of the Treaty of Westphalia lasted until the end of the 20th century. Only recently we seem to be in a so-called post-Westphalian period. That means if you look at conflicts, the way that they are fought in the 21st century in places like North Africa or in Syria, for example, some of the details seem to point back to the time of the 30 Years' War. We have now again armies that are not connected to any kind of territory. If you look at the so-called Islamic State, for example, it's moving freely without any connection to a territory, so that is not the same principle that was introduced after the 30 Years' War. And also a conflict like the one in Syria shows you a similar complex structure like we had it in the 30 Years' War, a huge number of outside participants, in this case Russia, for example, Iran, Turkey, Israel, the Kurds are connected to this war, and a large number of small